She gave a veteran her last blanket on a freezing night. She never asked for anything in return, just wanted him to stay warm. Emily Harper was a seamstress in a small Minnesota town, stitching clothes to survive the harsh winters. Walter Evans was a lonely man on the street, a veteran who'd lost everything. One day, the Marines arrived to warm Emily's home, and everything changed. Why did the Marines come for Walter? What did they do for Emily? Have you ever given your last piece of warmth to someone in need? Let's find out. Welcome to True, Quiet Stories. Let's uncover what happened in this story. If you love these stories, you can support the channel by liking and subscribing. In a small Minnesota town, the winters are unforgiving. Emily Harper lived there. She was 34 years old. She worked as a seamstress in a tiny workshop on Elm Street, a narrow space filled with the hum of her sewing machine. Emily's days were long. She stitched dresses, mended coats, and patched jeans, her hands nimble from years of practice. She smiled for customers, even when her fingers ached, even when the bills piled up, even when the chill seeped through the cracks of her drafty. Home. Her auburn hair was always pinned up in a messy bun, her apron frayed at the edges, her eyes tired but gentle, a gentleness that came from a heart that had known struggle, that had known loss, that had known love, a heart that gave even when it had little to give, even when the world didn't give back, even when the cold seemed to take more than it offered. Emily lived alone in a small house on the edge of town, a weathered wooden structure with a sagging roof, a broken furnace, and windows that rattled in the wind, their panes frosted over with ice that never seemed to melt. Her husband, Daniel, had passed away 4 years ago, a car accident on an icy road during a blizzard, leaving Emily to fend for herself, to keep her workshop running, to hold on to the warmth of the life they'd built, even in the silence, even in the cold, even in the years that had passed since he was gone. Emily kept going. She worked hard, but she had a kind heart. She gave kindness. It was all she could afford. Emily's life in Pinewood, Minnesota, was a daily battle against the frost and the past. The town had seen better days, its streets lined with shuttered stores, its fields blanketed in snow for months on end, its people worn by years of hard work, years of dreams deferred, years of a life that seemed to take more than it gave. Pinewood was a small community, just over 3,000 people, a place where everyone knew everyone, where Emily's workshop on Elm Street had been a fixture for years, a spot where locals brought their torn clothes, shared stories, and found a moment of warmth, a place that Emily's mother had started, that Emily had inherited, that Emily fought to keep alive, even when the odds were against her, even when the rent notices piled up, even when the world seemed to forget the workshop, to forget her family, to forget her. She grew up in Pinewood, in the same house she lived in now, where her parents had raised her with love, with resilience, with the belief that kindness was the greatest gift you could give, that warmth was the greatest thing you could share. That hope was the greatest thing you could hold, even when the world was cold, even when the nights were long, even when the struggles were heavy. Her father, Robert, had been a carpenter, his hands rough as he carved wood, his voice warm as he told stories by the fireplace, his laughter a bright spot in their small home, a laughter that Emily still heard, even now, years after he was gone, years after the heart attack took him, years after the workshop became her burden, her legacy, her life. Her mother, Clara, had been a seamstress, her smile a comfort to every customer, her hands quick as she stitched fabric, her faith a steady anchor for their family, her prayers a nightly ritual that Emily still whispered, even now, years after she was gone, years after the cancer took her, years after the workshop became her responsibility, her memory, her love. They didn't have much money, their meals simple but hearty, soup on Sundays, bread on weekdays, a rare treat of cookies when the budget allowed, but they had each other, and that made their small house a haven, a place where Emily always felt safe, always felt loved, always felt warm. Those memories were all Emily had left after Daniel died. A sudden loss that came on a snowy January night, his laughter silenced, his warmth gone, a void she couldn't fill. He'd been her high school sweetheart, her partner in every dream, her anchor through every storm, and his death on that icy road shattered the life they'd built, leaving Emily with nothing but the house, the workshop, the silence that filled her days, her nights, her heart. She'd been 30 then, her hands still nimble, her dreams still alive. But her world forever changed, her heart heavy with grief, with debt, with a life that seemed to demand more than she could give, more than she could bear, more than she could hold. She threw herself into her work, stitching from dawn to dusk, her hands steady as she sewed, her back aching from hours at the machine, her heart heavy with the weight of loss, with the weight of responsibility, with the weight of a house that was always cold, a house that hadn't felt warm since Daniel was there, a house that reminded her of everything she'd lost, everything she couldn't afford, everything she couldn't fix, even in the silence, even in the shadows, even in the years that had kept her apart. But Emily had a kind heart, a heart that still beat with the lessons her parents taught her, with the love she'd shared with Daniel, with the hope she held for a better day, a hope that lived on in the small acts of kindness she offered. Even now, even here, even in the shadows where no one saw her, where no one cared, where no one knew. She worked with care, taking pride in the stitches she made, making sure every seam was perfect, every patch was secure, every customer was cared for, a quiet gift to the people who filled her days, even if they never noticed, even if they never thanked her, even if they never saw the effort she put in, the love she poured into every stitch, the heart she gave to every piece. One freezing evening in late December, as Emily was closing up her workshop on Elm Street, she heard a faint cough from the alley across the road. The wind howled, snowflakes swirling in the air, blanketing the ground in a thick layer of white that crunched under her boots. She pulled her thin coat tighter around her breath fogging in the icy air, her hands numb from the cold that seeped through her gloves, a cold that had settled into her bones, a cold that reminded her of the broken furnace in her house, a cold that she couldn't escape, even in the silence, even in the shadows, even in the moments that passed her by. She squinted through the snowfall, her lantern casting a faint glow, and saw a figure huddled against the brick wall of the alley, a man wrapped in a tattered jacket, his head bowed against the wind, his body shivering in the sub-zero chill. Something about him made Emily stop, a sense of recognition in the way he sat, a quiet dignity despite the storm, a strength that shone through the layers of hardship that clung to him like the snow on his shoulders, a strength Emily understood, a strength she felt, a strength she couldn't ignore. She didn't know his name, didn't know his story, didn't know the weight he carried, but she knew the look of someone who'd lost everything, the look of someone who needed warmth, who needed kindness, who needed hope, even if he didn't ask for it, even if he didn't expect it, even if he didn't believe he deserved it. Emily walked over, her steps slow, her breath fogging in the air, her hands trembling as she held the lantern, as she called out, as she offered a smile, even if she didn't know who he was, even if she didn't know why, even if she didn't know what would come of it. The man's name was Walter Evans, though Emily didn't know that at the time, didn't know the story behind those weary eyes, didn't know the weight he carried, the weight of a war that had taken everything, the weight of a life that had left him with nothing, the weight of a silence that had become his only companion, his only comfort, his only truth. Walter was 70 years old, a veteran of the Gulf War, a man who'd served as a lance corporal in the U.S. Marine Corps, who'd led his squad through the deserts of Kuwait in 1991, who'd seen things he couldn't unsee, who'd done things he couldn't undo, who'd lost things he couldn't reclaim. He'd been a hero once, a man who'd saved his squad during a night ambush, dragging wounded Marines to safety under fire, his own body scarred by shrapnel, his own heart scarred by the screams of the men he couldn't save, by the faces of the friends he'd lost, by the guilt that had followed him home, that had followed him through the years, that had followed him into the alley where he now sat, where he now shivered, where he now survived, on the edges of a town that had forgotten him, on the edges of a world that had moved on without him, on the edges of a life that had left him with nothing but the clothes on his back, the dog tag around his neck, the memories in his mind, the silence in his heart. Walter had lost everything. After the war, his family, his home, his health, his very sense of self. The war a thief that had taken more than he could ever hope to reclaim. He'd come home to Pinewood in 1993, a different man than the one who'd left, his eyes harder, his smile gone, his heart heavier with the things he'd seen, the things he'd done, the things he couldn't undo. His wife, Ellen, had tried to help, her gentle hands a comfort, her soft voice a lifeline, her love a beacon in the darkness that had consumed him, that had changed him, that had broken him in ways she couldn't fix, in ways he couldn't share, in ways they couldn't survive. But the nightmares were too much, the flashbacks too real, the guilt too heavy, the PTSD too strong, a force that pulled him under, that pulled him away, that pulled him apart, until Ellen couldn't hold on anymore, until she passed away from a stroke in 2005, leaving Walter alone with their daughter Sophie, a daughter who grew up and moved to Chicago, seeking a life far from the shadow of a father who couldn't find his way back, who couldn't find his peace, who couldn't find his home. Walter didn't blame her, didn't fight her, didn't beg her to stay, knowing she was right, knowing he was broken, knowing he couldn't be the father Sophie deserved, the man he'd once been, the man he'd never be again. Walter had been living on the streets of Pinewood for years, a makeshift shelter of cardboard and tarp his only home, a thin jacket his only warmth, a cracked flashlight his only light, a small tin box his only possession, a box that held the things that mattered most to him, the things that kept him going, the things that reminded him of the man he'd been, even if he couldn't feel it anymore, even if he couldn't find it anymore, even if he couldn't live it anymore. Inside the box was a faded photo of Ellen and Sophie, taken on Sophie's 5th birthday, their smiles bright against a sunny beach backdrop, a moment of joy frozen in time, a moment Walter held on to, a moment that broke his heart, that kept him alive, that kept him hoping, even if he didn't know why, even if he didn't know how, even if he didn't know what for. There was also a letter Ellen wrote him during the war. The paper yellowed, the ink faded, but the words still legible, words of love and hope that had kept him going through the darkest nights, words he read when the loneliness felt too heavy to bear. And there was his silver star, a medal he'd been awarded for his bravery in Kuwait, a medal he'd buried in the box, a medal he couldn't look at, a medal that felt like a mockery of the pain he carried, of the lives he couldn't save, of the man he'd once been, a man he'd lost, a man he'd never be again. Emily didn't ask questions that night, didn't pry, didn't make Walter feel small for needing help, for needing warmth, for needing kindness. She simply went back to her workshop, her hands trembling as she reached for the last blanket she owned, a thick quilt she'd made for herself, the only thing keeping her warm in her freezing house, a quilt that held the memory of her mother's hands, a quilt that held the warmth of her past, a quilt that held the hope of her future, even in the silence, even in the shadows, even in the years that had kept her apart. She walked back out, her steps slow, her breath fogging in the air, her hands steady as she draped the quilt over Walter's shoulders, as she smiled at him, as she walked away, her heart a little lighter, knowing she'd done something good, something right, something that mattered, even if no one else saw, even if no one else cared, even if the world kept moving on without her, without him, without them. For weeks, Emily gave Walter her last blanket, a small act of kindness that became a ritual, a quiet promise between two souls who'd never spoken much, who'd never needed to, who understood each other in the way only the lonely can, in the way only those who've known cold can, in the way only those who've been forgotten can. Each night, Walter would return to the alley across from Emily's workshop, his step slow, his body shivering, his hands clutching the quilt she'd given him, a quilt that held the warmth of her mother's hands, a quilt that held the warmth of her past, a quilt that held the warmth of her heart, even in the silence, even in the shadows, even in the years that had kept her apart. Emily never asked for anything in return, never told anyone, never let Walter feel small for needing help, for needing warmth, for needing kindness. Even if he didn't expect it, even if he didn't believe he deserved it, even if he didn't know her name, even if he didn't know her story, even if he didn't know the weight she carried, the pain she held, the life she lived. In the shadows, in the cold, in the silence that had become her home. Walter would wrap himself in the quilt, his hands trembling as he pulled it tight, his eyes glistening with gratitude, his heart a little lighter, his cold a little less, his loneliness a little softer, knowing someone cared, even if he didn't know why, even if he didn't expect it, even if he didn't believe he deserved it. Emily's act of kindness went unnoticed by most, a silent gesture in a world that rarely stopped to see the quiet heroes, the ones who gave without asking for anything in return, the ones who loved without expecting love back, the ones who kept going even when the world didn't care, even when the world didn't see, even when the world didn't know. But one person did notice, a person who saw more than most, a person whose own life had been touched by the kind of quiet heroism Emily embodied, a person who knew the weight of a past unspoken, the power of a kindness unseen, the value of a man who'd given everything and asked for nothing in return. His name was Henry Larson, a neighbor who lived down the street, a 62-year-old retired Marine who'd served in Vietnam, a man who'd known men like Walter, who'd seen the toll war took on those who fought it, who'd lived with the same guilt, the same pain, the same silence that Walter carried, a silence Henry recognized, a silence he understood, a silence he couldn't ignore. Henry saw Emily give Walter the quilt one evening, his hands pausing as he shoveled snow from his driveway, his eyes catching the quiet exchange, the way Emily's face softened as she draped the blanket over Walter's shoulders, the way Walter's eyes glistened with gratitude, the way the moment held a weight Henry couldn't ignore, a weight that spoke of kindness, of love, of a hero forgotten, even in the silence, even in the shadows, even in the years that had kept him apart. He approached Emily the next day, his voice steady as he asked about the man, about the quilt, about the kindness she'd given, about the love she'd shared, even if she'd never known his name, even if she'd never known his story, even if she'd never known the man he'd been, the hero he'd been, the father he'd been, even in the silence, even in the shadows, even in the years that had kept him apart. Emily told him everything, her voice trembling as she spoke, her words a bridge between the past and the present, between the silence and the sound, between the shadows and the light, a bridge that brought Walter's story to life, that brought Emily's kindness to light, that brought a hero back, finally, after all these years, after all the silence, after all the shadows that had kept him apart. Henry didn't stop there, couldn't stop there, wouldn't stop there. Knowing Walter's story deserved more, knowing Emily's kindness deserved more, knowing a hero deserved more, even in the silence, even in the shadows, even in the years that had kept him apart. He drove to the local VFW hall that evening, his heart heavy with the weight of what he'd learned, with the weight of what he knew he had to do, with the weight of a story that deserved to be told, a story that deserved to be heard, a story that deserved to be honored, even if no one else saw, even if no one else cared, even if the world kept moving on without them. He called his old commanding officer, Major General Thomas Reed, a man who'd served in the Gulf War, who'd known Marines like Walter, who'd seen the toll war took on those who fought it, who'd lived with the same guilt, the same pain, the same silence that Walter carried, A silence Thomas recognized, a silence he understood, a silence he couldn't ignore. Henry told him everything, his voice steady as he spoke, his words a bridge between the past and the present, between the silence and the sound, between the shadows and the light, a bridge that brought Walter's story to life, that brought Emily's kindness to light, that brought a hero back. Finally, after all these years, after all the silence, after all the shadows that had kept him apart. On a crisp Tuesday morning, the sound of vehicles filled the air outside Emily's house. A rumble that shook the ground, that stopped Emily in her tracks, that made her heart pound with fear and curiosity. A sound that spoke of something big, something unexpected. A sound that would change everything, forever, for Emily, for Walter, for the town of Pinewood, for the world that would hear their story, that would see their love, that would remember their kindness, their heroism, their humanity, in a way that would last, in a way that would matter, in a way that would echo, louder than words, louder than silence, louder than the shadows that had kept them apart. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to True Quiet Stories. For more untold tales of valor, hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.